Welcome back to Hardware Legends. This is episode 3 and today we are talking about Sandy Bridge, Intel's last big step forward. And we're going to answer a few big questions, including what made Sandy Bridge such a big step forward for Intel and why it's considered the last big step forward for Intel. So let's get into it. First, let's take a look at what Intel was offering before Sandy Bridge came out. Intel's Nehalem CPUs launched in November of 2008, being the first of the new Core i7, i5, and Celeron lines of CPUs using the 45nm process with clock speeds and energy efficiency being higher than the previous Penryn generation of CPUs, and reintroducing Intel's popular hyper-threading technology. Nehalem also saw a reduction in the L2 cache size and an enlargement of the L3 cache, along with Intel Turbo Boost 1.0, which allowed the CPU's clock speed to increase incrementally to meet the workload requirements, and being limited by power and thermal conditions of the CPU. For the desktop users, you had the choice of quad-core non-hyper-threaded i5s and quad-core hyper-threaded i7s on both the LGA 1156 and 1366 platforms, with the flagship CPU being the i7-975, with most of the LGA 1156 CPUs having 95-watt TDPs and most of the 1366 platform CPUs having 130-watt TDPs. Nehalem touted 10 to 25% better single-threaded performance than the previous generation, while consuming 30% less power, which is huge considering in recent times many Intel CPUs only see a 5% performance improvement between generations. Following Nehalem, Westmere launched in January of 2010 with a die shrink down to 32 nanometers, improving virtualization latency, improvements to the AES processors, and including integrated graphics on certain CPUs. Westmere also saw the introduction of 6-core hyper-threaded CPUs on the LGA 1366 desktop platform, with the i7-990X being the flagship CPU. That also came with a $1,000 price tag, which was staggering at the time. Westmere also saw the introduction of i3 CPUs with dual cores and hyper-threading with 73-watt TDPs and entry-level prices which allowed anybody to buy them. Hyper-threaded i5s with higher clock speeds and Intel Turbo Boost technology were available for those who wanted something more powerful. Westmere was just an incremental step for Intel, who had big plans for Sandy Bridge, which launched 1 year later in January of 2011, and it created a huge splash throughout the industry, certainly giving AMD a shock which it seems like they didn't recover from until Ryzen launched. Sandy Bridge stayed on the 32nm process but had many upgraded features such as Intel Turbo Boost 2.0, which focused more on improving multi-threaded performance, a 256-bit cycle ring bus interconnect between cores, improvements to AVX with wider vectors, graphics and cache and system agent domain upgrades, and integrating the graphics and memory controller into a single die alongside many more improvements. Clock for clock, Sandy Bridge offered an 11.3% performance improvement over the previous generation, and this combined with the increases in clock speed and the huge overclockability of Sandy Bridge CPUs meant that they were a huge step up for Intel over the previous generation. i3 CPUs offered dual-core hyper-threaded CPUs with no turbo functions for an entry-level price, with the i5 CPUs offering quad-core non-hyper-threaded CPUs with Turbo Boost being made to be the value for money kings, especially the i5 2500K, which became immensely popular, although they did have a smaller cache than the i7 CPUs. For the high end, users had a choice of quad-core hyper-threaded i7s, with the 2600K and 2700K being the most popular choices and the most powerful CPUs offered on the LGA 1155 platform. The most powerful overall of Sandy Bridge were the Extreme i7 CPUs, going up to 6 cores on the new LGA 2011 platform, although this video will be focused on the mainstream Sandy Bridge CPUs. The main three Sandy Bridge CPUs that most people bought and most people remember are the 2500K, 2600K, and the 2700K. Although the 2600K and 2700K are exactly the same aside from a 100 MHz bump up in clock speed on the 2700K and also a slight price increase on the 2700K, so most people just ended up with the 2600K. I personally ran the 2700K, but that was only because the shop I was buying my parts from had run out of 2600Ks, and the 2700K was only slightly more expensive, so I just got that instead. Essentially though, the performance between the two was exactly the same. Intel locked all the non-K CPUs, which meant that overclockers and enthusiasts would all have to buy the K-series CPUs, which they did, although overclocking wasn't really possible on Intel's pathetic stock cooler, which meant that LGA 1155 compatible performance coolers became very popular, including the original Cooler Master V8 that many of you may remember. The 2500K, 2600K, and 2700K all came with soldered down internal heat spreaders, which meant with a solid cooler and a good C68 motherboard, the CPUs could achieve speeds of 5 GHz or higher, although this very much depended on the silicon lottery alongside your overclocking skills in order to get them up that high. Many people achieved around 4.5 GHz to 4.7 GHz though, without a huge amount of difficulty. That being said, most people don't overclock their CPUs, especially so back then. So how well did these new Sandy Bridge CPUs perform? Well, even at stock speeds, they utterly destroyed the AMD FX CPUs at the time, especially when it came to single-threaded performance. If you want to know more about what AMD was doing at this time, I suggest you go back and watch episode 1 of Hardware Legends. With all of them featuring 95 watt TDPs, they also destroyed AMD in terms of performance per watt, and Intel grabbed a huge IPC lead, which they continued to hold on to for quite some time, although today it's looking like that's going to change very soon. All of this caused Sandy Bridge to become immensely popular. Almost everybody who has been building computers for the last 8 years or more ran a Sandy Bridge CPU, or they certainly knew somebody who did. And many of the debates back then were not about if you should buy Intel or AMD, but were more about whether you should buy the 2600K or buy the 2500K instead. So surely with Intel's big step forward with Sandy Bridge, this would continue for the next generations of CPUs, right? Well, not really. And Intel's huge success with Sandy Bridge seemed to have made them quite lazy until AMD gave them a big wake up in 2017. Intel followed up Sandy Bridge with Ivy Bridge about a year later, which saw the die shrink down to 22 nanometer, improvements were made to the onboard graphics, RAM support, and PCI Express 3.0 support, although the IPC gains over Sandy Bridge were limited to about 5%. Core counts and clock speeds were more or less the same, however Intel only offered a single mainstream unlocked i7 CPU in the 3770K, which shared the exact same core count and clock speeds as the previous generation 2700K. This underwhelmed most people at the time, and soon after Ivy Bridge launched, it became controversial among overclockers because of its high temperatures when overclocking them. Especially the 3770K, which on average would run 10 degrees hotter than the previous generation 2700K, resulting in hitting thermal limits sooner or requiring higher end cooling in order to achieve the same overclock. People soon figured out this was because Intel had switched from soldering its IHS to using a TIM instead, or thermal interface material, which was of a poor quality, causing temperatures to soar compared to Sandy Bridge. However, Intel maintained that this was because of the die shrink to 22 nanometer and the thermal density causing the higher temperatures. This was easily disproven as many people delidded their Ivy Bridge CPUs and replaced the stock TIM with a better quality alternative, which brought temperatures down and allowed for better overclocking of the CPU. This would become common with Intel CPUs among the overclocking community for years after. Intel announced Haswell in June of 2013, which stayed at the 22nm process and carried over many features from Ivy Bridge, but included a few notable improvements such as a fully integrated voltage regulator, higher cache bandwidth, an improved front-end and memory controller, and many other minor changes. However, on the core count and clock speed side, pretty much nothing had changed, which once again frustrated many people, and the temperature issues which were present with Ivy Bridge only seemed to get worse with Haswell. My i7-4770K at 4.4 GHz ran up to 93 degrees Celsius with liquid cooling, a Corsair H110 cooler, because I never delidded my one. But you shouldn't need to delid your own CPU in order to get decent temperatures with it. So you might be thinking then, why wasn't Intel doing anything? It seems like they just kept releasing more or less the same CPUs each time. Well, they didn't really need to do anything, as at the time AMD wasn't offering any competition really, and Intel was almost a monopoly at that point, so they could just put out anything, and people really didn't have much choice but to buy them or just hold on to what they already had. This laziness from Intel would soon become a huge mistake, as it took them until their 8th generation of CPUs to finally increase the core count from 4 to 6 on the mainstream platform, and to start drastically increasing their clock speeds in response to a resurgent AMD who very much took advantage of Intel's lack of innovation and are poised to surpass Intel in terms of IPC and performance per watt in the not so distant future. Sandy Bridge has always been seen as Intel's last big step forward, although some people do consider Intel's 8th gen Coffee Lake CPUs to be a step forward, which they were in terms of clock speeds and core counts, but not in much else, so I do think it's fair to say that Sandy Bridge was the last big step for Intel. The fact that the CPUs offered so much performance at reasonable prices and had the potential to be massively overclocked showed that Intel had really been paying attention to consumers and released CPUs which were amazingly impressive both back then and even today, with the 2600K still putting up solid numbers for a 32nm CPU, especially when overclocked. Intel hit the ball out of the park with Sandy Bridge, but unfortunately they didn't follow up properly, and with all the delays and issues they have faced with their notoriously complicated 10nm CPUs, it is quite disappointing to think back that their last step forward was so many years ago. However, I am positive that once Intel releases their 10nm desktop CPUs, they will prove once again that they can take a big step forward, and they will show everyone in the industry what they can do, especially the consumers. Until that happens, however, and it may be quite a while, we will all just have to think back on the last legendary Sandy Bridge CPUs with fond memories, especially the i7-2600K being the last truly legendary Intel CPU to be released, at least in my opinion anyway, although I do love my i9-9900K that I currently run, and that's what I rendered this video on. I hope you have enjoyed my first Intel Hardware Legends episode. Next, we will be moving on to NVIDIA in episode 4, so if you want to catch that, please subscribe, as it also shows that you support me and this series. And as always, I'll see you next time.